Good morning and greetings from Oakland, California. Thank you for joining today as we have a discussion with Dr. John Powell, the Executive Director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, and Assistant Director Stephen Menendian on Targeted Universalism. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
It's good to be in conversation with both of you today. I wonder if you'd just start by sharing with people a little bit about your role and how you came to create TU.
Well, I'm the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, and actually created it years ago when I was at The Ohio State University, and Stephen was there with me. And part of it was, it grew naturally out of equity work. There were three of us that were very instrumental in pushing equity out in the 90s. Emmanuel Pastor, Angela Blackwell, and myself. And it took a while, maybe 10 years, for it to really grab hold. So in the 90s, people would actually run from us when they saw us coming. Say, here are these equity people again, because no one knew what it was. But then it started grabbing hold. But as it grabbed hold, it took a turn in some ways. Excuse me. People started, in practice, thinking of equity in two ways that I thought was sort of not helpful. One was just in terms of disparities. So there would be a normalized group or a dominant group, and you look at the disparities between that group and a less marginalized group, a more marginalized group. And then the second was that then all the effort was put on the most marginal group, which meant other marginal groups were not necessarily attended to, and the group that was considered dominant was certainly not attended to in any kind of empathetic way. And so that actually created tension between the groups. Now, Angela and Manuel will tell you, and I think they're right, that that's not what equity really is, but that's how a lot of people started practicing it. And instead of, once it took off, it was hard to pull it back. So Targeted Universalism came out of that. And really it sets a universal goal. Does not index directly to any particular group. It's just say, what does every group need? And maybe no group is getting that, including the more prominent group. And secondly, it says, so the goal is universal, and the intervention is targeted based on how people are situated. So the goal is to get every group to that universal, not just the most marginal. And so that actually dampens substantially the tension between the groups, and everyone is seen and appreciated. So that's how it came about, and for the last several years it's been working in pretty much parallel with the equity movement. I think in some ways it's accelerating now because of the environment we're in, but that's sort of the history of it.
Thank you, John.
I think there's been a challenge, particularly in the last 5 or so years, on how to frame remedies for inequality. How do you design a remedy in a way that is not just effective but sustainable? And we've kind of been caught in a binary. On the one hand, policies are framed either as what's generally called targeted or race specific or identity specific, or things that are universal in some way. So I remember about 10 years ago, Jamel Bowie said, and many others have said, the sweet spot are universal policies that have a disparate and positive impact. You know, and there's different ways even in that second frame of thinking about a remedy. So one might be, you know, what does it mean to be universal? Well, it means to touch everyone, or to treat everyone, or to reach everyone, or give everyone regard or respect. But one version of that has been this debate really since 2016 that it should be class-based. You get these debates over race versus class. So, you know, you have this broad class intervention with the assumption that that's going to bring people who are racially marginalized along. So Barack Obama, for example, said in his presidential book, the one he was running for president, he said that a universal healthcare policy would do more to reduce disparities in healthcare than a race-specific healthcare policy. Now, that's not necessarily the case, but that's the theory. So you get caught between this binary of it has to either be identity specific and targeted, or it has to be universal in some way. And we think both of those things just don't work. The evidence, in fact, in our opinion, is that the identity-specific stuff is effective but unsustainable. It leads to backlash, it leads to reversal, it just doesn't last, doesn't endure. And then the universal stuff just treats disparities, it either maintains disparities or insufficiently addresses them. A good example is affirmative action. There's a great modeling on this, brand new book by Richard Kallenberg, Arguing for Class Instead of Race. When you model affirmative action and you just use class, it actually doesn't create nearly enough racial diversity. When you use race, though, by itself, it also doesn't necessarily create enough class diversity. So you have to do multiple things, and we're caught in this binary. It either has to be universal or it either has to be targeted. I think targeted universalism breaks us out of that binary.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. You know, as when I was coming to the Institute and I was learning more about the frameworks, I thought to myself, why is tension bad? You know, that reducing the tension is one of the goals, or the backlash. And I've come to understand that sustainable progress is an essential part, but to me, not because of avoiding tension, but because of increasing our imagination for what is possible for everyone in this country and everyone in this world. I think that's what targeted universalism has helped me understand, is that if we're just trying to get everyone to who's doing the best, well, who says that those who are doing the best are doing well enough, that they feel a sense of belonging, that they feel a sense of fulfillment? What do you think about that?
Well, and that's exactly right. I mean, with the one, maybe one or two caveats. So you're right. I mean, you know, we have that circle in terms of when people say, we bring people together, we want to be safe. And we say, no, it's not safe in some sort of extreme way. We want to be safe enough. And we also, then we want a tension, but a dynamic, constructive tension. But we also don't want panic or trauma. So there's a point where there's not enough tension, if you could say, and there's a point where there's too much tension. So it's like enough tension where people can, you know, you go to the gym. If you go to the gym and your muscles don't feel any tension, they're not exercising. You know, it's not a spa. You're not going there to take a nap. But if you go there and tear your muscles, it's too much tension. So you want sort of the right balance. There's just come back to something Stephen suggested. So in a sense, targeted universalism goes beyond the question of equality. Because again, equality sort of invites a normative group. I'm equal to you. But to your point, what if all of us, and think of our healthcare system, what if all of us are not getting the adequate healthcare that we need? And so one group may be getting better healthcare than the other, but no group may be getting what really we need to thrive and be healthy as a society. So targeted universalism avoids just picking a group that's better off, or perceived as better off, and saying, what do we all need? And so in that sense, it's not just a programmatic approach, it's also a communication approach. We're saying every group deserves dignity, every group deserves to be considered. I often use Bob Marley's insight. To paraphrase him, he says that every person thinks his burden is the heaviest. And by that, I understand him to mean that we know our own suffering, but we don't know other people's suffering. And so we're willing to do things to remedy our suffering, but we oftentimes ignore other people's suffering. And targeted universalism invites recognizing everyone's suffering and dignity to everyone. So it really is about everyone. So to help the society is something that everybody would belong and everybody would have what they need to thrive. And one group may have 60% of that, another group may have 10% of that. Well, the goal is not just to close the gap, which might mean getting everybody to 35%, but the goal is to get everyone to 100%. So that's what targeted universalism does. It really is something about recognizing that every group matters, but they're not the same. because they're situated differently. And then just one last thing, a good friend and a wonderful thought leader, Iris Young, who's written a number of books, she's passed away, including Justice and the Politics of Difference. She says that much of what we call identity politics are really structural politics, because what people are struggling over is how their identity is correlated with a certain structural, systemic situatedness. And we think when we lose that and just focus on the person's race or gender or whatever, we're not realizing that it's the social meaning that's made out of that that puts the person in a certain position. So there's nothing necessarily inherent about being black or white, but we make social meaning and then we assign resources in relationship to that. And Stephen is actually just coming out with a new book on structural racism that I think will deal with a lot of that.
Yeah. Congratulations on that.
Thank you, thank you. I think the question is really important for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons it's important is because every time we make a move towards progress, there's often the seeds or seedbed of backlash to it. So the civil rights movement, you get Nixon. Obama, you get what we see now. And the question isn't whether there's going to be backlash or response. The question is, how strong is that response going to be? Can we blunt it and minimize it, or do we exacerbate it and make it worse? And too often we do things that make things worse. We inflame the backlash rather than tamp it down. And so tension can be productive. I think John's example of that is really good. But we make things worse. And then what happens is we undermine our own efforts by making things worse. So I can give you a bunch of examples. The last couple of years, since George Floyd's murder, what have been the major policy consequences or accomplishments? Very little that we can point to, and most that have, things like bail reform or drug decriminalization, many of those are now being completely rolled back, have been partially rolled back. So how do we make intervention sustainable? Think about the war on poverty, the set of programs in 1965 under Lyndon Johnson. Most of those lasted for about 30 years. Some are still in place, some are now, again, there's the constant attack on it. The question is not how do we accomplish something? The question is how do we preserve that accomplishment in the face of consistent opposition and backlash? And I think, having us think about that is different than how do we win a momentary victory.
I think that's really right.
If I can just add to what Stephen just said, one of the questions is, who is the we? And part of what we've done, especially those of us who've been involved in social and racial justice, and those who've been involved, I'd say, in sort of modern politics, MAGA, we define an enemy. And so the we is very small. And as soon as we think about the we think about the they or the, and so in a sense, many of us believe, and this is, came out of organizing, Alinsky, we need an enemy. And I often say, we should be hard on structures and soft on people. And instead we're soft on structures and hard on people. We think there's a bad actor that, and there are bad actors, but there's not a whole group necessarily. So we have a system where we have a gendered system in this country. Which means in many ways that men are given more deference, opportunity than women. But it doesn't mean all men are racist or sexist. It doesn't mean all men are bad. It just means there's a system. I'm 6'3", 6'4". In our society, people who are tall there's a saying that for every inch over 6 feet a man is, you make an extra $150,000 over your life, up to about 6'6".
Wow.
So since I'm 6'3", I guess I should get $450,000, right? But it doesn't make me a bad person.
Right.
Most people are not even aware of that. And so instead we attack the person. We make it all at Hamilton and not the structure. So, and even if I am 6'3", it doesn't mean I don't suffer. Right. Because we're all so complicated. We have multiple identities. So part of what's happened, the backlash is not just inflamed because of focusing on a particular group, but also we attack a group. And that group I mean, ultimately, if someone's attacked over a period of time, they're going to push back. And the question is, can we have we talk about a circle of concern where everyone counts, everyone matters, but it's not colorblind. When we argue for colorblindness, what we're really arguing for is structural blindness. And we need to see what structures are doing. We need to see how it's actually situating people differently. And I give one last example. I have 3 children. So if I come home and one of my children has strep throat, I go to the doctor and get the appropriate medicine. I don't come back and divide the medicine between the 3 kids.
Right.
And I give the medicine to the kid who's really sick. Another kid may have a stomach problem, different medicine. And it's not that I love the children differently, but they're situated differently. And so what they need to restore their health, because that's the goal.
That's right.
The goal is to get every kid healthy. But what's necessary to do that has to be targeted based on how they're situated. But if I come and say, I'm giving you the medicine and the rest of you don't count, well, how are the rest of them going to feel?
Yeah.
When it comes to medicine, we recognize the need to tailor. When it comes to policy, we sort of forget that. It's a very strange dynamic. I wanted to go back to something just briefly, and also building on what John said. Think about in the 90s, the fights over welfare reform. Again, unwinding the Great Society. I mean, the welfare bill, rolling all that back, changing it, turning to block grants. These fights continue all the time, and we have to be in a position where we can win these battles over the long term, not just the short term. And part of the challenge to what John said about the we is that is the policy viewed as a zero sum or positive sum? I think we tend to think of politics as zero sum, but most of the world is actually positive sum. Swimming pools are positive sum, public investments are positive sum. Things that we collectively enjoy together that scale are positive sum. When the economy is growing and jobs are growing, it's positive sum. Very, very few things are zero sum. But if they're framed as zero sum, then it's so much easier to create the they and the us or the we and the them. And once you've done that, then it's harder to defend. So targeted universalism allows us to bring everyone together, and it's not just, David Simon, who is the creator of The Wire, had a very fun...
One of my favorite shows.
Had a great... so for those of you who don't know, The Wire is a five-season television show set in Baltimore that looked at different facets, basically, of structural racism. Schools, policing, so on. He had a quote, he said, I'm not going to use the vulgarity, but he says, vulgarity, villains, and heroes. Basically, no villains and heroes. The real drama is in processes. And you could amend that to say processes and structures, because the processes and structures are doing the work, and then people are often epiphenomenal out of that. They're positioned in those systems and structures, and we need to attend to that. And what happens is there's this tendency to want to villainize. And we see the consequences of that. If you tell someone that they're if you tell all men they're toxic, if you say to all rich people that they're just natural villains, you're alienating potential allies, for your project, and then you're left with fewer and fewer people to help you push along your policy, or even worse, enemies who are going to want to roll back your policies. I listened to a podcast with Mark Andreessen, who I'm no fan of, interviewing in the New York Times, and what he said is he went to the Biden administration, he went to Biden's and met with the senior advisors and was basically told to F off. He couldn't even get a hearing, he didn't feel heard. If he had just felt heard, maybe he wouldn't have given millions to Trump. It's like we make enemies because where we wouldn't have to and don't have to, and there's a much better version of the world where we bring people in and we create a larger we.
And a much better version of ourselves. I think each time we villainize someone or we dehumanize someone, we're also bringing an element of dehumanizing ourselves, right? So I think it's a both and. It's creating allies, and it's also standing in our fullest humanity to not villainize. I want to raise another question, but first let me just mention to you all watching that we're going to have a chance for questions at the end. So please make sure you're writing down your questions. Go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll get to those. We'll get to those soon.
So if I could jump in just for a second, at its deepest level, Targeted Universalism really is one of the platforms that support belonging without othering. The two major platforms that support that are Bridging and Targeted Universalism. And to your point, is that when we other people, and Judith Butler's written about this in some of her work, is that when she talks about self-defense, she says the question is, where are the boundaries of the self? It's not such a simple question if we recognize we're profoundly connected to each other. So if you take the radical expression of belonging without othering, then I think the concept of allyship drops away. We're not doing stuff as allies, we're doing stuff because we respect life. And it's not like, and every living thing on the planet shares DNA, every living thing. And so it's not even just recognizing the belongingness of other humans, it's also recognizing the belongingness of animals, other animals, of plants. We are profoundly connected. And so as we, I think, lean into our full selves, that's part of it. And so the idea of an ally is someone has interests, and all interests are not the same, and all people are not situated the same. But there's something fundamental that all people deserve. And part of that is belonging, right? And so, and it's actually a radical idea, but it's also already baked into our country, into our society. So think about due process. One of the fights that's going on now is like, well, these people, immigrants, undocumented immigrants, they're not even citizens, so we can just ship them out to a country that maybe they've never even been to. And some of the courts have said, and David French had a good piece in the New York Times recently saying, the due process is not based on citizenship, it's based on personhood. So every person is deserving of due process. And I'll just end by saying, when we talk about targeted universalism, some people go to, yeah, but we don't have enough stuff. You know, so how do you deal with scarcity? There's a book of How Capitalism Ends, and the author makes the point that in a rich society, scarcity is a social concept. And we don't have a scarcity of dignity. We don't have a scarcity of belonging, or we do, but it's not like if you belong, I don't belong. Right. And so part of what we're saying is that to acknowledge everyone, to recognize everyone, to recognize Stephen doesn't mean I don't recognize you, but that's how we behave. And that's very toxic, not just for the people who are not recognized, for everybody, for our entire society. And that's what we're witnessing right now from the White House, from Congress, is that certain groups are not being recognized. When that's happening, there's a tendency to, okay, you're not going to recognize me, I'm not going to recognize you. But that's not the appropriate response, we think.
I'm just thinking about how lucky I am to get to work with both of you. So you've talked about the current landscape that we're in, the current political landscape. Talk about how TU is a tool that's relevant or not relevant in this moment for policy change and organizational change.
Well, I'll say two things. One, I think it's TU in some ways, Targeted Universalism, is well suited for not just where we are, but where we want to go. So there's, as I said out at the beginning, there was some way in which we did equity that raised questions. Now I say, if there's a leak in your roof, most of us would not say, okay, blow up the house.
Agreed.
You know, we say fix it. And so there was a leak in equity that could be fixed. And we should be honest about that. There are always things we can learn and grow, and that's true with TU, it's true with belonging, it's true with concept of equality. How do we continue to build on it? There are a lot of people who attacked it, and just the attack was not principled. It was really political. How do we use this to drive a wedge between people by attacking DEI without even defining what DEI is? But for people who are principled, who wonder about equity, who wonder about some of the problems, who wonder about the leak in the roof, TU is a perfect intervention. Because there have been situations, all of us may know of, where in terms of practicing equity, we attacked one group. We attacked oftentimes white people, we attacked white men, we attacked straight men. And it's not that people should be, or groups should be above criticism, but it's one thing to criticize someone in the spirit of belonging and love, and another in the spirit of dehumanizing and anger. So we say equity should be about everyone. TU makes, it really underlines that. Say, really, this is about everyone. And if we're going to have a future that's worth living, it has to be about everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think TU, Targeted Universalism, belonging and bridging, really moves us in that direction. I will say, before I hand it over to Stephen, it doesn't mean we don't get upset. It doesn't mean we don't get angry. It doesn't mean we don't criticize. So it's not just a soft kumbaya. Dr. King, Reverend Dr. King, talked about righteous anger. And for him, righteous anger was the anger that was associated with love. You care about God's creation, and when that's being violated, you're angry about it. But the anger is coming out of love. And the anger is not saying, therefore, cut people off. It's saying, bring people in. It's saying, respect this beautiful place we call Earth. And it really hurts me to see us abuse the Earth and abuse people. So it's not saying we have to wash out our emotions and be zen about everything. But it is saying that we have to recognize our interconnectedness and that everyone has a seat at the table.
Well, we're in an incredibly perilous moment where the entire edifice of what's now called DEI is under concerted, not just what it has been legal attack, but political and cultural headwinds. And part of the challenge is understanding that the attack on it is largely, in large part, not good faith, but strategic. You know, a couple of years ago, Christopher Rufo has this famous saying that he wanted to annex everything Americans hated into critical race theory, so that people would associate critical race theory with everything that America, again, the public dislikes. And that just, I mean, whether it's critical race theory or equity or DEI, or it's just the next thing that they're attacking. You know, and it's also, you have to understand the evolution, right? What diversity, equity, inclusion are very different practices or principles, but they've been organized programmatically in many institutions in the same office. And now it's concentrated one, you know, it's become a single target for all these things. It's absurd in some ways. Like, who's against diversity? You know, like, but then because equity becomes the target, then diversity is drawn into that. Targeted universalism hopefully is a way to help us get out of that, you know, to help us break out of this. Again, the evolution, in the 90s, a lot of these programs that are now in DEI offices are what we call multiculturalism. That's right. Now, there's been this evolution, it continues to evolve and will evolve. I think targeted universalism is the way to meet the moment. It's how do we build sustainable infrastructure programmatically and program and policy interventions in ways that actually close some of these extreme disparities, give universal regard to everyone. Again, most things are not zero sum. We can give everyone universal dignity and regard. Yeah. That's at a minimum, and I think TU does that.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about TU as a mechanism, as a process, as an approach, and there's these 5 stages to it. So let's unpack those 5 stages a little bit. And the first one is about developing a universal goal. When you think about defining the universal goal, what should be thought of in that? Who's a part of that? How is the table set? How do you make a good universal goal?
Well, in some ways, the process of coming to a universal goal is healing in and of itself, because so you and I are going to come up with the universal goal. What that means is I have to listen to you. What that means, and you get to co-create. I don't impose a goal. I don't say everyone should do something. I say, what do you think, Ashlin? What does different groups think? And in a sense, that's intuitive. We used to live in what was called a democracy. The idea of a democracy is that people have a voice in making rules that they live by. So TU and belonging actually is just a deeper expression of that. And so the universal goals, if people feel like they're heard, so Stephen gave the example earlier, that's half the healing. They don't, most people can accept that they don't get everything they want. But it's hard to feel like you're not even listened to, and it's especially about your own life. So the process of coming up with a universal goal and listening to everyone and including everyone, having people co-create, is a powerful first step. And it's not, it doesn't mean consensus, it doesn't mean a vote necessarily, but it means really attending to and trying to make sure that everyone is recognized and listened to. Everyone is not only at the table, everyone gets to actually co-create and design the table. They're not disregarded. So that's the universal part. And even when that part happens, before you get to the subsequent parts, you can see a lot of healing. When people feel like they're heard, and there's really good research on this, something magic happens, right? A lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of, even violence is because people feel like they're not seen, they're not recognized. Not simply that they didn't get everything they want, but they were disregarded. And that's really the politics of this country right now, politics of resentment. And so we have people saying, oh yeah, those, DEI people don't see you, right? And of course, DEI is about not being seen.
Right.
It's like
right.
When groups who are historically marginalized show up in an institution, they're not seen on the walls, they're not seen in the curriculum, they're not seen in the laws. You think of Spike Lee, Do the Right Thing. The whole movie is about who's on the walls, who's reflected back at you. Everybody should be reflected, not just Italians, not just blacks, not just straights, not just gays, but everybody needs to be reflected, to be recognized. So the universal aspect of that, coming up with the universal, is where you start that.
I'm thinking of Giancarlo Esposito pointing at the Italians on the wall in the film. It's a great image and a metaphor, right? Like who's shown up. This is I think the most important and critical step in the design process. And John alluded to it. So you have to establish and build the table. And the hard part is people know who do community engagement is getting community engagement is difficult.
Yes.
It's hard, it's arduous, but you have to build the table. Now, don't confuse the table with the design team.
Okay.
The people who actually will end up running with this process can be a smaller representative group, representatives of the larger table, but the table really needs to have all the stakeholders, everyone who's directly affected, everyone who administered, the experts. Make that table big, get and listen. And I think part of the mistake that sometimes people make is they think that they can do this quickly and efficiently. But people who know community, processes.
Transformation is not always quick.
No, it's not. In my opinion, the first step, the goal setting step, if done well, should take at least 2 months.
Okay.
At least 2 months. So I worked with, 7 or 8 years ago, I worked with the Advancement Project of Southern California. I think they've renamed. And they were working on establishing a universal goal as part of a TU process for pre-K, or for children who were, I think, younger than 5. And I was so impressed. I went up to Sacramento. They had 2 draft goal statements. And they said they'd been working on this for 6 to 8 weeks. And which one should they choose? And they were agonizing over every word, every noun, every verb, adjective. And I think that's right. I think that there should be some general sense of what the problem is. John called it healing. We're not doing something because there's no problem. If there's a problem, that's what motivates this engagement and this intervention. So there's some problem that you're trying to resolve or some aspiration that you're trying to reach. It could be either. And so you begin the process, you have the table come together, you can draft statements, circulate them, get feedback. Again, not everyone has to sign off. It doesn't have to be 100% behind or even 90% behind it, but there should be some general sense that this meets the moment. And if there's ways of modulating or adjusting the universal goal. So if the over specificity becomes a drag, then make it a little more general. Or if it's insufficiently specific, do the opposite. I think there's 2 interesting debates that come up on setting the universal goal. The first is, can you use percentages? Does it have to be quantitative, qualitative, or both? The task force that the Biden administration set up to deal with homelessness explicitly used TU. And it set as a universal goal to reduce homelessness in the United States by 25% by 2025. Now we know that was not accomplished, but it was an effective quantitative version of the universal goal, established universal goal. The second debate is, in calibrating the universal goal, should it be set above or slightly below or at where the best performing group is? And I think John and I both agree it should not be set at where the best performing group is, because that would then just be reducing a disparities focus.
Right.
I think much of the time it should be set above so that you're lifting everyone up, but I wouldn't make that a strict rule.
Okay.
I think you need to use, again, bring everyone together, deliberate about it. And then if maybe the table needs to have a committee that goes, that goes back and then
Gets
brings
in
it,
the weeds more.
brings it back to the overall group. But I think that's the general idea of how you do this.
Let me add a couple of things before we leave. That two things. I was very much involved in New Orleans after Katrina. So one of the things to think about is what groups really need to actually effectively participate. So it's not just having people show up. Some of these processes are complicated. Berkeley was looking at building a new campus out in the Richmond area. It has, I think, 160 acres out there. And it invited the community to comment. But then when you look at the plans were for a non-developer, a non-designer. They were radically obtuse. It's like, what does this mean?
It's Greek.
And so we actually got a developer that actually represented the community, someone who could translate for them. So to participate, it doesn't just mean you come to a meeting. Sometimes you need resources. Sometimes you need childcare. Sometimes you need transportation. But it's also important to think about who's not there. And especially if it's the same group that's not there every time. So if we say, it's like if you have something on Berkeley campus, I teach at Berkeley, and trying to find parking on Berkeley with a permit is hard.
Yes.
But if you don't teach at Berkeley, if you don't have, so what I'm saying is that the designing to make sure that everyone can really participate, as Stephen suggested, takes some time. And if it's like, maybe if you're saying, why aren't a community in East Oakland coming to Berkeley, maybe the meeting should be in East Oakland. But ultimately saying is pay attention to who's not there. Pay attention to make sure that one group is not dominating. So it's not just performer. It really is saying we collectively care about what everyone has to say about this, especially the key stakeholders, and we'll wrestle with that. We'll deal with that, and we'll set up a process that's flexible, and not say, well, we ask people online, and
Right. In one language.
yeah, exactly, and
Right.
people didn't respond, and being especially sensitive if the group that's being most effective is not at the table. So you have to be proactive to make sure it's really a process that's reflective of universality.
So you're showing up with curiosity, seeing people, hearing people, doing the work to make sure it's accessible to different people's situatedness. Ideally, it is measurable, it is comprehensive, and it's taking the time that's needed to really discover what that right goal is. So you've done that. Congratulations, you've done that. Then you're moving to part two, which is assessing how the general population is doing, according to TU. Why does that matter, assessing the general population?
Well, you're looking at me, so I'll answer this one first. You need to know where you are with respect to this goal. And really the second and third steps are intertwined, because the third step is then to disaggregate. One time I heard John say, what we're really doing in a lot of equity work is disaggregating, aggregating, disaggregating, aggregating, recombine. And I think that's true. At the time I was struck as profoundly true, because what you really want to do is you want to know where you are in the moment. So if the goal is, let's say everyone should have health insurance, and 80% of the population is, but 60% of Latinos and 90% of whites, you need to know that difference. You need to know where people are. And part of it is further disaggregating. So, maybe it's, 75% of Latino men, but 50% of Latino women, right? So there's, when you look at gender, when you look at parental status, when you look at class, and you intersect all these things, you get different results. So we need to know where we are overall before we disaggregate. Because if we disaggregate without knowing where we are first, then there's no baseline to even compare it to. Again, the baseline is not the goal, but we need to have a sense of where we are.
Yeah.
And it could be anything. So what if we're looking at, I was just reading in the other day about how math test scores in the United States are just dropping, plummeting. On the NAEP test, which is the international, the United States is just doing really poorly. And the decline was happening before the pandemic.
Wow.
So it's not even just the pandemic. Well, if we don't know where we are, then how can we know where to set?
Yes. Yeah. It's like if I'm at the gym, right, and I'm trying to make sure I'm doing something that's not a spa day, but not, tearing my muscles, then what's the weight I'm starting at, and how do I build? Yeah. Baseline and goalposts. Okay.
Yeah. And that also can affect things. So think about something like COVID. Part of this is iterative and flexible because you're dealing with stuff in the real world. How much time do you have? We talk about climate change, and my friend Manuel Pastor says we have 15 years. He said we simply don't have 100 years to fix this problem. If we don't do something in the next 15 years, from his assessment, and not just his, we're toast. So that gives you something. You have a time horizon. So it's important to have a sense of where we are collectively in relationship to this problem. And that may affect, you may take some drastic measures that you wouldn't take if you had 50 years, if you had 200 years. So it's important to know where you are, know who we are collectively, and then know who we are in a disaggregated way. And as Stephen suggested, without falling back into a zero sum or even into just disparities. Because even the group, COVID is a good example. The group that was doing better, the different groups and groupings, was still exposed to COVID. The fact that younger people did better than older people was interesting, right? But now, when they look back at it, it's not necessarily did better across all the different indicators. Did better here, but did worse here. And so it really is important. The data gives you a snapshot, gives you a picture, hopefully a dynamic snapshot of where we are. And again, the situatedness matter because different groups will be affected differently, partially because of the structure, partially because of the history. But we know that difference matters. So, and we did that with COVID. When we said who could get the vaccine when it first came out, we didn't say it was random. We said people who were most vulnerable. And then some people were left, So anyway, it's just this common sense that we don't treat everybody the same because people are not the same and people are not situated the same. But the aggregation gives you at least a general benchmark to work from.
A reminder that in a few minutes, we're going to have the opportunity for you to ask questions that are coming up for you. So please take note of those or go ahead and put those in the chat. So as a recap, there's 5 stages to TU. We've talked about stage 1, developing a universal goal. Stage 2, assessing the general population, how it's performing. Stage 3, which is about assessing different groups and looking at situatedness, nuance, aggregating, disaggregating, aggregating, disaggregating. And then step 4 is about identifying and analyzing how structures are impacting different groups' performances, right? So you talked about go soft on people, hard on systems. What does it look like? What's an example of a time when TU has really identified the structures that needed to change and how that impacted group performance?
Well, there are many examples. And one thing that's implicit that probably should be explicit is that when you see people doing a certain way, groups doing a certain way, what's the implicit and explicit explanation for that? So if you say, black boys are not graduating at the same rate as their white counterparts, or even as girls, how do you explain that? When you say Latinos are more likely to drop out of K-12 than their white non-Latino counterparts, how do you explain that? So one explanation is that, black boys are not interested in school, or Latinos are not interested in school. So we have an explanation, and the explanation can be completely focused on the group itself, or it can be there's some situation, there's something going on, there's something in the water that's affecting these groups differently. Raj Chetty, in one of his big studies, looked at how black boys are doing. And a lot of it, for example, we know in terms of schools that if you go to a school that's well-funded, good teachers, integrated, reflected in the curriculum, students tend to do better. So he did a national study, and that's what he found. Except for black boys. And I know Raj, and we talked about this. It's like, well, how do we explain this, right? So you start looking for, do you look for a personal failure, a personal explanation, or do you look for a structural one? And what he came up with was that black boys were not networked, that network matters. And it was something he had missed, right? So he looked at income, he looked at family income, he looked at were you living in high concentrated poverty or not, were you going to, so looking at all these factors, but there's something he had missed. And again, if that something is right, when you change that, it should have a huge impact. And it did. And so he didn't change the boys, right? What he changed is that they were not networked. And we know in terms of graduate school, law school, if you're in a study group, it matters if you're doing this by yourself or alone, independent of your individual grit and intelligence. So that's just one example, but there are many. Again, TU can tell us to look for the structural system things, and of course we know that, right? If you go to a restaurant and you come home at night and you're not feeling well, you say, I got the flu, I got COVID or whatever, but then you find out everybody at the restaurant, right, at your table, yes, got sick. Yeah. Right? Say, okay, so it wasn't just me. There's something in the food. Was it everybody? Was it my table? Was it the whole restaurant? So TU tells us to look for things in the structure, and if they're affecting different groups differently, are those groups situated in some way? Is there something that we're missing, as in the case of networks with black boys?
And specifically in the study, Chetty found that mentor figures, so it didn't have to be a father, it could have been a coach, a teacher, another parent in the neighborhood. That seemed to be the decisive factor, but hard to find that just in data alone, right? You had to sift a little deeper. So a couple things. One is that the design process for TU, one of the differences between equity is that in many equity programs, and I'm thinking, for example, of the long New York Times expose on University of Michigan, DEI, is that targeted universalism can't be entirely top down. The design team can be, again, top, but it can't be a small cohort of equity officers or diversity officers designing this. You have to bring everyone to the table. Imagine setting a universal goal around education, and you bring in school counselors, administrators, teachers, and parents, but you don't bring in the students. What kind of assessment are you going to do in step 4? Right. Are you really going to learn? You have the experts come in and say, well, we think the students are struggling because of this. And the parents say, we think it's because of this. And the teachers say it's because of this. And a student comes in and can tell you, well, why didn't you just ask us?
Right. Right.
Exactly. You need to bring in people who are actually experiencing it. So I think it's really important that, again, you bring everyone to the table. The design team can be a smaller representative group, but you need to make sure it's not, it has to be top down and bottom up, which is harder. You know, John was talking about the Richmond Bay campus and that process. You know, for people who have maybe 2 jobs or a single parent, going to these community meetings and learning about the arcane financing of a multi-billion-dollar campus, and you know the cost structure and the financing, that's difficult. But what John is saying is you have to create a mechanism for participation that facilitates and enables participation. And a TU process should, at least at the table stage, right? Building the table and designing the goal should have, and again, you can have the design team go and do the mechanics and report back, but that has to be part of the process.
And you mentioned something, again, just to lift up what Stephen just said, even language, right? I mean, you can imagine if someone is visually impaired,
Right.
What do they need to fully participate? This is going to be very different than someone who doesn't. And so part of it is really thinking through, and to some extent you could say the visually impaired, you could think about that's something that the person doesn't have. But you could also think about a structured design for a particular set of attributes that a group have. The example I like to use is luggage racks in airplanes. They're overhead, so for people who are shorter, and it takes a certain amount of upper body strength. So what group in our society tends to be shorter with less upper body strength? Women, right? Now, it's sort of interesting. So what do women do? Because women have had this experience of trying to lift something up over their head, and it's been awkward, and people want to get on the plane. So what women do is disproportionately check their luggage. They actually, so when you have structural problems and you try to solve them at the individual level, the individual is taxed. So now the woman has to get to the airport an hour earlier than her male counterpart to check her luggage, and she leaves half an hour later, sometimes without her luggage.
And has to pay extra now.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's a solution, but it's a wonky solution that doesn't fix the structure. So when you have these structural phenomena at play, when we leave it to the individual to navigate, it's oftentimes the attacks are quite wonky.
So that leads us to stage 5, which is about implementing the targeted strategies. Tips that people should consider. What are the most important aspects of implementing these targeted strategies?
Well, my number one rule of thumb is that you should have at least 3 or more different unique implementation TU strategies. So if you know, I remember working with the Ohio State Board of Education, which in the midst of working with them on a diversity policy swang to the Tea Party. And one of the mantras of the kind of Tea Party conservatives at the time is one size does not fit all. You know, and in this case, they're right. Well, that's kind of the heart of TU, is a recognition that one size fits all, right? I don't know, it popped into my mind when John was talking, but TU is a little bit like an emergency room. It's like people are coming in with different problems, but there's a space of regard and care and a set of common instruments, and sort of different. Someone who comes in with a heart attack is going to be treated someone who has a gunshot wound, yet it's still a space of treatment and care. And so it's like we have different tools and different implements, but it's a common structure: nurses, doctors, physicians, et cetera. So you need to have at least 3 different implementation strategies to start. And then over time you can build more, and you can triage it, right? So it's like, if this is a more urgent problem, not necessarily a more serious problem, right? Like some might have a serious problem, but it can be dealt with in an hour, and a physician can say, I'll get to you in a second. Whereas someone, this is not, I have to deal with this other thing right now, so those are the things we should think about. And I think, again, the targeted strategies are for different groups based upon their situatedness. It might be vastly different, right? Like a translation service, it might be different than a childcare service, right? And so we might need both of those things as part of our TU implementation strategies.
So let me make 3 quick points. One, because people are situated differently, you have different interventions. There may be an impulse to work on the easiest group, and I want to suggest to people you avoid that impulse. It's almost the opposite. So the group that's furthest away from the goal should, in some sense, most of the time, not all the time, but be moving faster. right? Because they have more ground to catch up. There's a danger that if you just focus on the group that's almost there, you'll never get to the group that's further away. So just to be aware that you may need to have, and I'm not saying ignore the group that's almost there, but I'm saying make sure that we don't ignore the group that's farthest away. Think about homelessness or unhoused. It's like, well, there's some people who, they're 80% of the median income, they have money, little help, we can house them. Great. But then we defer the group that doesn't have any income, that doesn't have a job. And that's a hard one. So that 80% median income, they can't afford that either. So you have to really make sure that you're not just cherry picking. The other is that, which is implicit in this, so these 5 requirements, they're guidelines. They're not categorical. One of the things you want to do also is evaluate. So have an evaluation process. And that may be implicit, but it should be explicit. And then the last one I'll mention is that Targeted Universalism is a programmatic approach, but it's also a communication approach. Which was reflected even in the universal at the beginning. So to really communicate, so don't just do a program and put it under a bush, but really communicate, because what you're doing is practicing regard for everyone. So talk about it, broadcast it. We really do care about everyone, and this is how we're doing it, and we're learning. So I would just add the evaluation and the communication as part of the TU.
I think that's really important to name right now, the naming it, the broadcasting it, and the celebrating it. We do care about all, and we have a vision and a belief for how all of us can be doing better in a time where the instinct may be to be a little bit more timid or a little bit more under the radar. I appreciate you both so much for really illustrating the ways in which TU is one of the core components of creating a world of belonging without othering, as you've defined in your most recent book, that at the center of belonging is really this concept of co-creation, and that there's these 4 other elements of inclusion, recognition, agency, and connection. And I was hearing all throughout this conversation the ways in which TU really practices that and makes that really tangible. All right, let's hear from all of you. Again, a reminder, please put any questions that you have in the chat. So the first question here about TU requires mechanisms for providing input from everyone. How do we do this when our communication mechanisms are so polarized and separated? It's a great question.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I would, so 2 things though, in terms of participating, in terms of co-creating, it's more than input. It's in terms of recognizing a person's dignity and their right to be part of this process. Again, it's more than input. In some ways, I think it's a salve, it's a heal to the polarization. And to some extent, we have to be deliberate. So we have a project at the Other and Belonging Institute, which we call the Long Bridging Project, which is to reach across and bring people together who normally don't come together, who normally don't hear each other. Now, sometimes we don't hear each other because we don't want to. It's like a guy, he's wrong and he's different than I am, and I need to shut him up. And so, so part of it is really creating the space, and it may be hard for one person to create that space, to get the different perspectives and different voices in. Now, if we do that, it doesn't mean that everybody says everything. If I know that people who know me, people who love me and care about me are present, I don't necessarily have to be present myself. But if I feel like everyone who looks like me, everyone who cares about me is shut out, then I feel hurt, then I feel ignored, then I feel not recognized. So there's some nuance in this. But I think in terms of, in the book, The Power of Bridging, I have a whole section, or also in Racing to Justice, which is, there's a new edition out. I have a whole chapter in there on polarization and how to deal with it. The last thing I'll say on this, and this is a great question, some of these things can be dealt with at an interpersonal level, but a lot of them cannot adequately be dealt with at an interpersonal level. We're looking at large structures and systems. So, for example, social media, how we communicate in that environment can't be completely addressed at the individual level. And that's not saying we shouldn't do what we can at the interpersonal level, but it's just saying that's not enough. We have to look at, as you said, our structures and systems are being corroded, which also means, therefore, that someone have to pay attention to those structures and systems. Last example, it used to be in the 1950s and 60s that we thought a lot of this work would be done in public schools. In fact, one of the roles of public schools was to bring people together who had different views and to make citizens out of them. And citizens, in this sense, the Dewey sense, was people who could take other people's perspective, which really is listening, which is really bridging. But we've actually changed the role of public schools. They're not really public schools anymore. What, did Trump just end the federal role of education? So there's an attack on bringing people together. And the attack is not just public schools, the attack is public. So now we don't like public transportation, we don't like public housing, we don't like public schools, we don't like Social Security because it's social. So what we're doing is, there are large, powerful forces, including the richest person in the world, who are trying to destroy the capacity, the structures to bring people together. We have to counter that. We have to, again, we can do it at the individual level, but we also have to think about how do we build institutions, mechanism, cultural expressions that help us come together. It's a challenge, but that's a challenge that's worth taking on.
Yeah.
In most cases, though, there's going to be a convener or an organizer that's kickstarting this process. And so that organizer, whatever it is, it might be, again, if you're in a corporation, it might be the DEI office. If you are, it might be a funder, a foundation trying to bring people together, or it might be, community-based organization. The convener can reach everyone. It can invite everyone. You can't force people to the table, but you can attempt to build that table. And the question says, when our communication mechanisms are so polarized, usually this is at a local, community, or institutional context. So we're not talking about mass media here. This isn't about like Twitter or Fox News. These are usually local contexts.
Very helpful. Great. Next question. When it comes to assessing the phases, I admit I'm reticent to create and keep data on vulnerable communities in our current climate. Are there solutions to this?
Well, I don't know if I can fix your reticence to that, but
Fair enough.
But I think you need to be aware that keeping data and collecting data, even disaggregated by race or other sensitive categories, is not illegal. Not even in California, which is Prop 209. There was a subsequent initiative in 2001 that was nicknamed the Son of 209. It was called the Racial Privacy Initiative, that would have prohibited schools and public entities from collecting and reporting this data. The census does it. The federal government already does this. I'm not sure what your reticence is, so without knowing specifically the basis of your reticence, but maybe you just are afraid that if you do this, you're going to make yourself more of a target for federal investigations and so forth. I'd say, if you keep data on everyone and everything, and then you're able to disaggregate it in that way, you should be fine. Just say, I keep data on everyone. Again, it's universalistic in that regard. There's no legal problems with collecting, reporting, or aggregating data.
Well, let me speak to that a little bit. We've worked with a number of indigenous tribes throughout the United States, and I think particularly in some groups, I won't name the groups, but again, they felt that they weren't concerned about the legality of it, they were concerned about the use of it. They felt that the government and others were using the data to violate their privacy, to control them in some way. So they didn't want any data. We worked with them over a number of months and years, And the point was, can they control the data? They need data too. So it's who's controlling the data. So if you have specific concerns, and certainly, you don't want necessarily all these large language models controlling all of your personal information, what do you do about that? It doesn't mean we don't need data. It just means we need to create mechanisms, safeguards, controls. And when we do research, we always try to make sure that the community we're engaged in is asking questions they want answers to. So it's not just research about a community for somebody else. It's not mining something and extracting it. It's really saying, what do you need? And maybe the government would be limited in terms of access to this data. So I think I could see some reason to have some reticence given the current climate and given our lack of trust. So for example, right now, the federal government is trying to get tax data as a way of actually tracking people who are undocumented. Well, that's extremely problematic. So there are, I think, reasons to be concerned. But then how do we actually navigate that environment?
Okay. Single interventions are often implemented because it's not financially feasible to implement multiple interventions that meet a range of needs. How do you make the economic case for TU?
Well, I would say a few things. There's, probably in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a sense that you had to be comprehensive. I worked with a school system, again, I won't name it, but they were trying to do some version of TU. I think they had 120 initiatives. And I came in and basically said, let's get it down to 3, maybe 4 at the most. But the response was, well, but all of these problems are interrelated. That's the point. So from a systems theory, you look for what's called inflection points, which are 2 or 3 things that populate across a whole system. I won't go into all the details now, but the point is that the goal, TU is outcome oriented. It's not process oriented. So it's not saying we did something. The question is, did it have an impact? We're measuring that. And if done well, not only is quote unquote economical, but it's also impactful. Is it producing a different set of outcomes? If not, we haven't succeeded. We want to really look and see, we want to change things. Now, in finding that inflection point is tricky. But you think about when the government changes the borrowing rate because the economy is slowing down. That's an inflection point, because as you might say, that's sort of very indirect. If the economy is slowing down, why don't you buy more stuff? But the bet is that if money is cheaper, people will spend money, and people spending money will increase demand. It's like 3 or 4 steps, and they don't know if it's going to work. So they do it and they watch. So that's the way I would say approach TU, is that come up with very thoughtful interventions and then try them and see what happens.
So it's a really interesting question. I think the main reason single interventions are implemented is because the way that policy typically works in the United States is you cobble together a majority on a city council or a state legislature, you pass a bill, and the legislature empowers the relevant department to implement it. And it's usually, 1-to-1. It's not, okay, here's the policy, and now the department is supposed to implement 6 strategies to implement that policy. So I don't think really the core reason that it's one policy to one design implementation strategy is because of economics. It's usually because that's just how policy works in the United States. TU is very different in that regard. You need multiple implementation strategies. And we know this. I mean, we make accommodations for different groups all the time. Dietary accommodations for mothers, for people with disabilities. TU is simply an expression of that. We recognize that. I think the case for it is that if you can only do one thing, then you shouldn't call it TU. I think it's a misbranding, and then what you'll be doing is actually undermine the long-term sustainability of the larger TU frame, if that's what you're doing. I think you need to have at least a few things that you can do. And some of those things might not be very costly. I was working with a community college system in, I think it was a Midwestern state, I'll be general. And they were saying that they were disaggregating and looking at why students were not persisting through the program. Mm-hmm. They wanted people, it's a 2-year program, I believe, and they were looking at data over 4 years. And it was something like 53% of students were graduating within 4 years. And when they looked at the different students, the groups, they saw very vast disparities. Again, disparities are diagnostic. It's like the thermometer that John was talking about. Take your temperature. It's not the problem, but you use it to identify and point yourself towards the problem. And they saw, okay, student parents were having a problem with childcare and therefore not able to, students with disabilities. One of the things they found is that students who were low income or economically distressed, it actually was not a huge financial problem. It might have been like a $100 or $200 bill from the previous semester that prevented them from enrolling. And once they implemented the policy to waive under a certain amount, a huge number of students were then able to re-enroll. So these things are not necessarily very expensive. It's sometimes policy process, it can be very cost efficient. It can, so think about a translation service. You can pay someone to translate something from English to one language, and it scales because then you just copy that and send it off to all the parents who speak that language. Some of these things are not particularly expensive.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our time. Want to appreciate you for taking time to be with us. Thank you, John. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you all.